Alright, so we're gonna start off with a plane, and let's make this 1000 by 1000, and I'm gonna give it 100 segments in each direction, and we can call this the ground. And then I will get a sphere. I'm gonna give this a radius of 500 and 36 segments, and I'll change the type from standard to icosahedron. And then I want to move this to be 485 on the y-axis. The reason I know all of these values is because I've tried this once already in the preparation for this tutorial. Anyway, I'm gonna go to the deformers tab, and let's get the collision deformer, and I want to place this underneath the ground object or the ground plane. And in the colliders tab, I want to drop the sphere into this link box, and when I do this, you're gonna see something happen. The sphere is now pressing into the ground, and if I switch the sphere off, and let's look at this from the top, you can see we've created a kind of dent into the ground. I'm gonna switch the display mode to road shading with lines, just so you can see that a little bit better. Okay, next up I'm gonna get some mo text, and I'm just gonna type out the number 2, and I wanna set this to be aligned to the middle, and then just rotate it flat and sort of move it back into the center of this dent we made with the sphere. Now at this point, this is where you would use your own logo or a client logo you might be working with. I just happen to use the number 2 to illustrate the effect, but it can work with any custom logos you may have. Okay, I'm gonna get a second collision deformer, and let's also make this a child of the ground object. And in the colliders tab, I want to drop my text into this, but this time I want to change the solver from intersect to inside stretch. And when I do that, you're gonna see now the 2 is sort of doing the reverse of what we did with the sphere. Instead of creating a dent, it's sort of raising up that area around the geometry of the letter, of the number, sorry. And if I move this around, you can see it stretches the geometry below. I want to set this to be 5 on the y-axis and leave it right there. And I can shut this off as well. And now we have all of the geometry we need for this effect. Next up, we're going to do the texturing and lighting. So I'm going to get my first texture. I'm using an image which I found on Google Images, and this is it right here. I'm just going to hit open, and I can click no for that, doesn't really matter. And I can drop this onto our geometry. And if I go to the texture, I want to change the projection mode from UV mapping to cubic, just so I get more tiles like this. I'm gonna get a target light. This is gonna be our first light. Let's move it closer, and in the details tab, I want to change the fall off from none to inverse square, physically accurate. And let's just pull this back a little bit and widen it. And I'm gonna change the intensity to just 25. So it's very dim, but we're gonna copy this light. And we just wanna sort of reverse the X position and the Z position as well. And I'm gonna set it on the Y position of 100, so it's really low like this. And bump up the intensity all the way up to 100%. And this is going to be the main light in the scene. The reason I have this other light is just to fill in this other side. If we didn't have it, this would be completely blacked out and we would lose all of the details on this side of the 2. So let me switch this back on, and I'm going to enable shadows on both of these, just the shadow maps soft. And I'm going to look at this from above, and if I render, now we can see an impression of our logo, but we still don't have the cobblestone effect working yet. We only have the texture loaded into the color channel. To get the stone sort of bumpy look, we need to work with the displacement channel. So I'm gonna enable the displacement channel and then load up our image again. I could have just copied that from the color channel, but it doesn't really matter. And you can see our texture starts to look kind of interesting. I'm gonna enable sub polygon displacement so we have more resolution, and then I'm just gonna jump out of here and render this. And now you can see we're getting something. We can certainly see the separation of each of the stones, but you can see they look very coarse and very rough, and it doesn't look very nice at all. So at this point I could try and go into Photoshop and sort of prepare this image a little bit better, maybe blur it, make it black and white and so on. But there's actually a different way to do this, and it's probably a little bit better. This application right here called Crazy Bump. Now you can see I've already tried this before, so let me start again with our original image. When you first open Crazy Bump, it asks you which of the two sides look more correct. So I think this one here, because the area with the stones are raised up, whereas over here they're sort of being pressed down. So I'm going to choose this shape, and Crazy Bump actually generates all different types of channels rather than just the displacement, which is the second one here. You also have an occlusion channel, specularity, and of course the diffuse that we've started off with. We are only interested in the displacement, so I'm going to go to the displacement tab, and I want to increase the depth to be, say, 80, and I want to enhance the detail some more just to get some sharper edges, and I want to soften this up as well, so something like 20, just so we get some finer looking surfaces. And then I can save this, and I only want to save the displacement to file. You could go ahead and save all the other textures if you had configured the other different channels. I've already done this before, so I already have like 2 different textures already. Okay, I'm gonna save it anyway, and let's jump back into Cinema 4D, and here I am gonna load up the texture we've just generated. So this is it right here, and you can see I did this before in the trial run for this tutorial, but let's just grab one of these and hit open, and now we're getting something completely different. If I were to render this now, you can see that the stones look much smoother, but now the displacement is just way too strong. We can't even make out where the number 2 is on that render. So I'm gonna go to the settings and set the strength to about 75% and the height to about maybe 2.5%. And I've still got subpolygon enabled, so that's fine. And when I render this again, this is much closer to what we are after. I'm going to look at this from roughly what my final frame is going to be like, so sort of from above, and we can just about make out where the logo is here, but it's not separate enough from the background. The rest of the stuff we're not interested in. So what I'm going to do here is insert a second plane object, and this is going to be our water. So if I just make this the same size as the original plane, so 1000 by 1000, I can go to create, load material preset, visualize materials, and in the liquid section here I want to get the water turbulent. I can drop this onto our plane, which I should rename now to water. And now if I were to look at this again from that same angle and render this, now you can see our logo being separated from the rest of the scene. You know, this area is the only area rising above the water. But we also have something interesting happening on the outside here. The water is actually intersecting with some of the geometry generated by the displacement map. You know, even though in the actual scene, this plane sits exactly on the same Y position as the original plane, but when we render, the displacement map is raising the ground above the water, and you kind of get this really cool effect where the water is sort of draining in between the cracks of the cobblestone. Alright, I actually don't like how this water preset looks, but it's a good starting place. So I'm gonna go into the texture, and I'm gonna remove this weird coloration which was enabled over here, and I'm just gonna change the color to be black. And in the transparency tab, I wanna also remove this blue tint. It's in the absorption color, so let me set this back to white, and I want to increase the brightness of the transparency to just maybe 75%, and that's what I'm going to change for now. If I were to render this, you can now see what's happening, and we have a really nice looking highlight over here. In other areas though, like you know, where the specular of the light isn't showing up, we can't really see much of the water. It just almost seems as if there's some kind of weird dark blanket covering the rocks, but you don't get this effect here where it looks like water. So let's get a sky object to try and bring back some of that detail by bouncing off some reflections. So I'm gonna get the sky object, and I'm gonna load up the sky texture, and this is the image which I used for this. And of course, all of the files used in this tutorial will be available to download for you on the post page of this tutorial. I'm gonna hit open, and this dialog box always pops up. It doesn't matter what you click. I'm gonna hit no, and I'm gonna just pop this onto my sky object, and I'm gonna go to apply a compositing tag and untick scene by camera, because I don't want to see this in the background when I look at low angles like this. Let me show you what I mean. I don't want to see any of this. Okay, so now if I were to render this again, I will start to see some of the reflections bouncing off the water in different areas, and that looks really cool. But I don't want the color from this image. You may want that, but I'm just going to go into the texture and apply a filter, and in here I will just click colorize to remove all of the color, and now it's just grayscale. Okay, I'm gonna also just jump into the water texture, go to the reflection tab, and I'm gonna remove this Fresnel, which is on in the preset, and maybe increase the brightness to about 50%, just so we catch even more reflections from the sky object. Okay, that looks fine. I think the actual rock texture needs some more work done to it. I'm gonna go to the texture, go to the color channel, and I'm gonna copy this and paste it into the bump channel, just so we can have a little bit more surface detail because right now it was a little bit too smooth. I'm gonna bump up the strength all the way up to something like 70%. So it's really exaggerated. Maybe that's a little bit too much. Let's try just maybe 50. And that looks fine to me. If you want to preview a higher res preview in your viewport, you can go to the editor tab of the texture, and under texture preview size you can set this to something like 1024, and this is going to look a little bit closer to what it actually is like when you render, but in the viewport as well. Okay, that looks cool. I'm gonna go to the reflection channel. Let's enable this, and I'm gonna set the brightness to about 25%, and under texture let's load in some Fresnel, and also make this about the same. And I'm gonna go to the specular channel, and I want to create a really sort of tall but thin highlight. So the rock texture almost looks glossy, and the effect I'm trying to emulate here is a sort of kind of wet look. So imagine, you know, there's been some rain in the scene. You want to get this effect where the surface looks sort of glistening and really shiny because some water has sort of washed off the surface. And if I just zoom out here and render this again, this is sort of the final look of our Cinema 4D. At least in Cinema 4D, we can go into After Effects to make this look a little bit nicer. But as far as Cinema 4D goes, this is the effect. Perhaps one other thing is if I go to the lights, I can create a blue tint on the fill light, and let me just increase the intensity slightly. And the main light, the bright one, I'm gonna make this orange, so something like this, just to make it look a little bit more interesting. Okay, that looks fine. In the original preview, if I jump into After Effects and show you, this is one of the raw renders which I did in the trial run for the tutorial. You can see the main light is changing intensity and sort of flickering throughout the entire sort of timeline. And the way I did this was using some espresso. So if I go to the main light, I can get an espresso tag. This should open up the espresso window. I want to drag the light into here, and you can see I did this before where I looked for the noise node. So I'm just going to drag this here, but you can find this by going to New Node, Espresso, General, and Noise. And this is basically a random value generator. So I can drag this to the light, and let's attach it to the intensity of the light. And I want to set the amplitude to about 1.5, just so we stay in the higher value range. We don't want to go too low, but also I want to make sure that positive only is ticked. That way the numbers generated by this noise node never go below 0. So that looks fine. You can see as I scrub through my timeline, this is flickering. Now at this point you would just go in here and set your duration. So my original scene was 12 seconds, and you might want to do some kind of camera animation. Let me show you how I did mine. I'm gonna get a camera and let me get a null object. Let's call this the target, And if we look through our camera, we want to add a target tag. And in the target object link box, we want to drag in our target null. And let's zoom in with our camera now, and let's set our starting point. So this kind of angle, so really close and quite low, almost looking at the horizon. And this is going to be our starting position at frame 0. So let's keyframe that, and let's go to the end of the timeline, and we just want to set the end position. So imagine something like this, and just insert the second keyframe. And that's it. That's really how I did the camera movement. As you can see, it's very simple. And you know, by using the target object, the logo stays centered the entire time as we just sort of rotate and zoom out. Okay, that looks fine. Some render settings. We can go to the anti-aliasing to begin with. And I'm going to set this to be best, 1:1, 4:4, and maybe a threshold of 5%. And for the output, I want to make this 1280 by 720, 24 FPS, and I will set this to all frames. And in the save section, I'm gonna save this as a TIFF, depth 16-bit, and we don't have any alpha channels, so I'm gonna just keep this as it is. I'm gonna go to effect and enable some depth of field, and I'm gonna set the blur strength to 10%. And if I jump back into the scene, especially on this first frame here, I want to maybe decrease the angle at which I'm looking at this. Let's save that keyframe. If I render this, there's a lot of detail in the back here which is coming through, but I don't really want any of it to be visible on this frame. I only want to focus sort of on this part of the logo. So if I go to the camera and under focus object, I'm gonna drag in our target object as well. So the focus of the camera is not gonna go beyond the actual logo. And now if I render this again, okay, nothing happened. That's because I forgot to enable rear blur in the details section of the camera. So let's try that again. And there we go. So now the background is completely blurred out. That might be probably a little bit too much blur, but it doesn't look too bad, so I'm gonna keep it like that. And one other thing which I nearly forgot, and I got reminded by just looking at this frame, is our water. In the original animation, if I jump into After Effects and show you, you can see that the water is animated. It's moving, right? There's some movement on the surface. And I haven't set this up yet in this scene. So here's how you do it. If we go back to that water texture, we want to go to the bump channel because this is where that surface detail is being generated. Let's jump in here. There's two different noise maps combined together to get this effect. Let's go into the first one, and there's a control here, animation speed. We want to set this to something like 1, and you're gonna see your preview change slightly, but you don't see any animation. That's because you have to right click this and enable animate. And when you do that, any animation you've set in here will now be sort of previewing in this little window. That's too fast though. I'm gonna set this to be only 0.1. So it's much slower and much calmer. I can go back and you will see that again the animation has disappeared. That's because you have to do this for each individual preview that you may have in your texture. So if you have multiple layers, you will have to do this each time. So let's jump into the second noise layer, and as you can see, no animation. Even if we enable it, animation speed 0.1, still nothing until we actually enable animate, and now we can see some movement. Now if I go back to the to this other layer where the two of them are being combined, we can now see the animation being previewed with both textures. Okay, so you won't see this in your viewport. This is only going to appear when you render. So if you've never used that that effect before, you may want to set up a few preview renders just to make sure that your animation speed is correct. Okay, so as far as Cinema 4D goes, we are finished. At this point, you would just output this render to a location on your hard drive and jump into After Effects to do some basic compositing. So I'm gonna jump into After Effects, and this is one of the raw renders which I did in preparation for this tutorial, and I'm actually not too psyched about this one because it didn't turn out as well as I would have liked it to. In fact, I think what I've just made here in what is a fraction of the time is actually a lot better looking than the render I have in After Effects, but this still looks pretty good, so I'm gonna go ahead anyway and show you some of the little tricks which I did to get the final look. So the first thing which I did was to just boost the levels, because I think I rendered this out a little bit too dark, but this may not be an issue on your scene, but you know, just adjust this until it looks bright enough. Keep in mind that some of the frames will be darker anyway because of that flicker we set up with the light in Cinema 4D, but I think my whole scene was a bit dark overall anyway. Okay, that's fine. I'm gonna create a new adjustment layer and go to Effect, and I'm gonna get Magic Bullet Looks. Let's go in here and hit Edit. I'm gonna set the zoom to be 100%, and I'm gonna go to my favorite section of looks, which is the lens section. I use this section to try and add some realism effects to my scene, because this whole section is designed to sort of simulate actual lens and camera artifacts that you would get if you were using a real camera. So you've got things like chromatic aberration, vignette, edge softness, and so on. So let's layer this together and see what we can come up with. Starting with chromatic aberration, I'm gonna insert this, and I'm gonna just split the green and magenta by 1 and blue and yellow by just 2. And now we can see this color fringing, and it's more intense on the edges, just as you would get on an actual image taken with a real camera and lens. Okay, the next effect I'm gonna apply is the vignette. Let's expand this out and maybe dim it to about 50%. And I'm gonna get the edge softness, and I'm gonna set the blur size to just 1 and the quality to 10. And another cool thing these effects do when you combine them together is they just bring more attention to the center of the image. You know, so with the vignette, the center is the brightest section of the image, and the outside is darker. With the edge softness, the outside is blurred, but the center is perfectly sharp. So that can work out really nicely as well. I'm gonna apply a lens distortion effect. this just kind of bulges out the image. This is probably too much, so I'm just going to lower this to about maybe 7%. And the last thing I'll add in this lens section is this haze or flare. And this just adds this sort of wispy kind of light into the scene, and it just kind of looks interesting. I'm gonna just desaturate the color here, and I'm gonna keep it orange though. You can try out all the other different colors to see what works best for you, but I think the orange fits well with the orange lighting in the scene. I'm gonna switch reflection off, maybe increase the spillage and the softness, but I'm going to lower the reach, so we only sort of have it on the edges but not too much in the middle, because that's where our logo is. Okay, and then the last effect I'm going to apply is the colorista 3-way, and this is just a 3 color wheel color grading tool. I'm gonna insert some blue into the shadows, not too much. Make it a little bit darker. These controls are very sensitive, so even if you move them slightly, it makes a very big difference to the final image. I'm gonna maybe inject a little bit of that orange back into the highlights, because I think it looked a little bit too flat. Again, very subtle. And you know, you can play around with this until you find the perfect balance for you. But that was a little glimpse into the post work I did for the original logo. So that's that. I'm gonna hit finished and render this thing out, and that's it. That is how I created the Cobblestone logo effect. I hope you learned something new, and I hope you use the techniques you saw in this video to make some stuff which is much better than what I have here. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.